In the high-stakes world of global technology, loyalty is a currency that devalues the moment the heart stops beating. Olivia learned this truth in the coldest way possible. After her father is framed for corporate espionage and dies under a cloud of mystery in police custody, her world is dismantled by the very man she called family. Her uncle Arthur used a legal gangbang of forged data and bribed officials to seize the company throne, branding Olivia a thief and casting her into the shadows of the city she once helped build. Reduced from a brilliant tech prodigy to a hunted fugitive, Olivia's life hangs by a thread as she flees through a torrential downpour. She collapses on the rain-slicked pavement at the feet of Jiho, the legendary Korean Mafia boss known for his cold efficiency and shadow empire. Struck by the warrior's fire still burning in her eyes despite her broken state, Jiho ignores protocol and pulls her from the edge of erasure. The glass and steel headquarters of the Williams tech empire didn't just represent wealth. It was a cathedral of innovation where the air hummed with the electric frequency of the future. For 24-year-old Olivia, life was a code written in the finest logic and the clearest purpose. Every morning began with the silent, pressurized ascent of a private elevator, rising 60 floors above the city's smog into a sanctuary of minimalist design and high-speed data streams. As the door slid open, the world below became a distant blur of gray, replaced by the Glass Kingdom, a realm where her father, Elias, had taught her that information was the most sacred currency of all. Olivia moved through the open concept floors with a quiet, focused grace. To the engineers and analysts, she was the brilliant prodigy who could see patterns in the noise before the AI even flagged them. To the world, she was the crown jewel of a dynasty that had encrypted the world's most sensitive secrets. But in her own heart, she was simply a student of her father's integrity. She often found him in the server rooms at 3 a.m., the blue light of the monitors reflecting off his glasses. He wouldn't just be managing the system, he would be sharing coffee with a junior coder, listening to their dreams with the same intensity he gave to billion-dollar contracts. A legacy, Olivia, he would say, his voice a low anchor in the hum of the cooling fans, isn't built on silicon. It's built on the truth you refuse to compromise. Her office was a testament to this philosophy, uncluttered, transparent, and filled with the warmth of the morning sun hitting the polished white marble. From her desk, she could see the sprawling cityscape, a vast network of lives her father's work protected. She spent her days refining algorithms that served as digital shields for the vulnerable, feeling an unshakable sense of security. The walls were reinforced with the strongest tempered glass, and the servers were protected by the most advanced biometrics in existence. In this world of filtered light and absolute order, betrayal was a foreign concept, a ghost story told of lesser companies. Olivia felt like the center of a perfectly calibrated universe. She would walk the halls, her heels clicking against the glass floors, passing the boardroom where her uncle Arthur often sat in the shadows, his face a mask of practiced support. At the time, she mistook his silence for respect and his sharp gaze for pride. She didn't realize that in the world of tech royalty, the most dangerous viruses aren't written in code. They are born in the hearts of those who share your blood. For now, the sun stayed high, the servers stayed cool, and the kingdom felt invincible. She was the daughter of a titan, living in a palace of light, unaware that the clouds were already gathering on the horizon. The golden era of the Williams Empire felt eternal, but the first hairline fractures appeared not in the code, but at the family dinner table. Uncle Arthur was a man of quiet, calculated presence, always hovering just at the periphery of her father's light. He didn't carry the raw, creative fire that Elias possessed. Instead, Arthur was a creature of shadows and spreadsheets, a man who spoke in the measured tones of a strategist. During their Sunday dinners in the Great Hall, Arthur would lean back in his velvet chair, swirling a glass of amber scotch, his eyes tracking every movement Olivia made with a sharp, predatory curiosity. "You're working her too hard, Elias," Arthur would say, his voice smooth as silk, punctuated by a smile that never quite reached his eyes. A girl of her age should be enjoying the spoils of the kingdom, not buried in the server architecture. It sounded like concern, a doting uncle's protective instinct, but Olivia felt the underlying chill, a subtle suggestion that she was a burden or perhaps a distraction. He would often reach out to pat her hand, his touch dry and lingering, while he whispered about streamlining the company's ethics to maximize the family's true potential. He was a master of the slow poison. In the weeks leading up to the disaster, Arthur began planting seeds of doubt within the board of directors, always under the guise of loyalty. Olivia remembered walking past the library and hearing his low, rhythmic cadence as he spoke to the lead shareholders. He spoke of her father's radical transparency as a liability, a weakness that would eventually leave the Glass Kingdom vulnerable to predators. He painted Elias as a visionary who had lost his grip on reality, while positioning himself as the pragmatic anchor the company desperately needed. When Olivia would join them, Arthur's demeanor would shift instantly. The serpent's smile would return, wide and welcoming. He would praise her latest algorithm in front of the board, only to pull her aside later to suggest small adjustments that would bypass her father's strict encryption protocols. "For the sake of efficiency, Olivia," he would murmur, his breath smelling of expensive tobacco. "Your father is a great man, but he is a man of the past. You and I, we are the future." He was building a web of isolation around her, masquerading as her greatest ally while he quietly replaced the security detail with men who answered only to him. In the brilliant light of the Williams estate, Olivia couldn't see the shadow he was casting. She saw only a supportive uncle, never realizing that the hand resting on her shoulder was already measuring the weight of the crown he intended to steal. The stillness of the Williams estate was shattered at exactly 2:14 a.m., not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the sanctuary's light. In an instant, the hum of the high-tech security system, the very heartbeat of the Glass Kingdom, went flat. Olivia sat up in bed, her breath hitching in the sudden vacuum of silence. The emergency red lights didn't kick in. The biometrics didn't chime. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the master wing were splintered open by the rhythmic thud of a battering ram. Before Olivia could reach the hallway, the house was swarming. Men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas and the blinding glare of high-intensity flashlights, flooded the corridors like a dark tide. They didn't move like the family's security detail, they moved like predators. Olivia watched from the shadows of her doorway as her father was dragged into the light of the foyer. Elias Williams, a man who commanded global markets with a whisper, was forced to his knees on the cold marble floor. He was still in his silk pajamas, looking smaller than she had ever seen him, yet his eyes remained fixed on the staircase, searching for her, pleading with her to stay hidden. "Elias Williams, you are under arrest for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and the compromise of national security data." A voice boomed, a cold, mechanical recitation of a script that felt rehearsed. Behind the wall of black-clad officers, a figure stepped forward. It was Uncle Arthur. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The flashing blue and red lights from the cruisers outside strobed across his face, revealing that same serpentine smile, now sharpened by the thrill of the kill. He didn't look horrified. He looked satisfied. "I'm so sorry, Elias," Arthur murmured, his voice dripping with a counterfeit grief that made Olivia's skin crawl. "I tried to warn the board. I tried to cover for your instabilities. But the evidence is undeniable." Olivia watched, paralyzed, as they ratcheted heavy steel cuffs around her father's wrists. The sound of the metal teeth clicking shut felt like the closing of a tomb. As they hauled Elias toward the door, he managed one final look toward the shadows where Olivia stood. His lips moved, a silent command to run, before he was shoved out into the freezing rain. Arthur lingered for a moment, his gaze drifting up the stairs toward Olivia's hiding place. He didn't call out to her. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and followed the officers into the night, leaving Olivia alone in the hollowed-out ruins of her life, the black folder clutched to her chest like a shield against the coming storm. The following 48 hours were a blurred montage of fluorescent lights and the clinical smell of police stations, but the world didn't truly end until a cold Tuesday morning. Olivia had spent every waking second in the lobby of the central precinct, her black folder hidden beneath her jacket, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She was waiting for a miracle, for a lawyer to break through the wall of silence Uncle Arthur had built around the case. Instead, she received a visit from a chaplain and a detective whose eyes refused to meet hers. They didn't lead her to a visiting room. They led her to a small, windowless office that felt like a vacuum. "There was an incident in the holding wing," the detective began, his voice a low, practiced monotone. "Cell 402. Your father, Olivia Williams, he was found unresponsive during the morning head count." The words hit Olivia like a physical blow, stripping the oxygen from the room. They called it a cardiac event brought on by the stress of the charges, but Olivia knew better. Her father's heart was as strong as his resolve. A man who hiked the Alps every summer didn't simply wither away in a cell within 2 days. The grief was not a wave, it was an avalanche. It buried her under a weight so heavy she couldn't even scream. She sat paralyzed as they handed over his personal effects in a plastic bag, his wedding ring, his broken spectacles, and the same silk pajamas he had been wearing when the world was right. The injustice of it was a jagged blade turning in her chest. Her father, a man who had dedicated his life to radical integrity, had died like a common criminal in the dark, his name dragged through the mud of fabricated treason. As she stumbled out of the precinct into the biting wind, she saw a black sedan idling across the street. The window rolled down just enough to reveal Uncle Arthur's eyes. There was no grief there, only a cold, predatory finality. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. The last obstacle to the throne had been cleared. The Glass Kingdom was now a tomb, and Olivia was the only witness left to the truth. She clutched the black folder so hard her knuckles turned white, the encrypted data inside, now the only piece of her father left in the world. The man who had made her feel like the center of an unshakable universe was gone, and as the first drops of a freezing rain began to fall, Olivia realized she wasn't just an orphan. She was a target. The transition from mourning to erasure happened with a clinical, terrifying speed. Before the soil was even settled on her father's grave, the corporate machinery of the Glass Kingdom had been re-engineered to exclude its rightful heir. Olivia arrived at the Williams Global headquarters just 3 days after the funeral, only to find the biometric scanners, the ones programmed to recognize her unique iris pattern since she was a child, flashing a defiant, blood-red access denied. In the grand lobby, a space of marble and soaring glass that had once felt like home, Arthur stood waiting. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by a phalanx of attorneys and a new security detail in charcoal gray uniforms that looked more like paramilitary gear than corporate protection. Gone were the familiar faces who had greeted her father with smiles. In their place were men with cold, dead eyes and holstered sidearms. "I'm afraid there's been a change in status, Olivia," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the hollow atrium. He held up a thick stack of notarized documents, the paper crisp and white against his tan skin. "The board has met. Given the unfortunate nature of Elias's criminal activities and his subsequent passing, his shares have been liquidated to cover the company's massive legal liabilities. According to the bylaws, control has defaulted to me as the surviving executive director." The legal gangbang was a masterpiece of treachery. Arthur had spent years preparing for this, forging a trail of digital breadcrumbs that made Olivia's father look like a traitor and Olivia look like his primary accomplice. He presented a court order, signed by a judge whose campaign he had funded, effectively freezing her personal assets and stripping her of her board seat. It was a hostile takeover executed with a pen instead of a sword, but the blood was just as real. "You have 10 minutes to clear your desk," Arthur murmured, stepping closer until his shadow completely enveloped her. "And Olivia? Don't bother taking anything proprietary. The servers have already been wiped of your access codes. You are no longer an employee, an owner, or a Williams in the eyes of this board. You are a liability we are officially offloading." The betrayal was so absolute it felt like a physical amputation. Olivia looked around at the glass walls she had helped build, the algorithms she had perfected, and the legacy her father had died for, all of it now under the thumb of a serpent. As the guards moved in to escort her out, their hands heavy on her shoulders, she realized Arthur hadn't just stolen a company, he had deleted her existence. She was being cast out of the kingdom, a ghost in her own house, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the black folder hidden beneath her coat, the only piece of the truth Arthur hadn't been able to find. The transition from the glass kingdom to the cold concrete of the city was instantaneous and brutal. Olivia found herself standing on the sidewalk, the heavy glass doors of her father's life clicking shut with a finality that felt like a death sentence. The rain had intensified, a relentless gray curtain that blurred the soaring skyscrapers into jagged tombstones. She didn't look back. She knew Arthur's men were watching from the tinted windows of a lobby, waiting for her to break. Instead, she ducked into the neon-lit sanctuary of a 24-hour internet cafe in the industrial district, a place where the air smelled of stale coffee and desperation. With trembling fingers, she slid the thin black folder onto the desk and pulled out the single, high-density flash drive hidden in its lining. This was the contingency her father had whispered about in the final months, the Black Folder Protocol. As the ancient computer hummed to life, Olivia bypassed 3 layers of biometric encryption until the truth finally bled onto the screen. It wasn't just corporate espionage, it was a systematic ledger of Arthur's treachery. He hadn't just stolen the company, he had been selling the firm's security backdoors to the very entities her father had refused to work with. The forged documents used to frame Elias were all there, along with a time-stamped communication log that proved Arthur had initiated the medical emergency in cell 402. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't died of a broken heart. He had been liquidated like an inconvenient asset. Just as the final file decrypted, the cafe's front window exploded inward. The sound was a deafening roar of shattering glass and screeching tires. A black SUV had jumped the curb, and 4 men in charcoal gray tactical gear, Arthur's cleaners, poured out, silenced pistols drawn. They weren't there to talk. They were there to delete the last surviving witness to Arthur's crimes. Olivia didn't think. She moved on instinct. She snatched the drive, shoved the folder under her arm, and bolted through the grease-stained kitchen toward the back alley. The freezing rain soaked her green jacket instantly, clinging to her skin like a second, colder layer of fear. Behind her, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on wet pavement echoed through the narrow corridor of brick and shadow. Every time she turned a corner, the red and blue glare of distant sirens mocked her, reminders that the law now belonged to the man who wanted her dead. She was no longer a princess of the digital age. She was a ghost in the machine, running for her life through a city that had forgotten her name, clutching the only evidence that could set the world on fire. The labyrinth of the industrial district had become a death trap of slick cobblestones and blinding neon. Olivia's breath came in ragged, burning gasps, each one a plume of white mist that vanished into the freezing downpour. Her boots skidded across the oily surface of a narrow alleyway, the black folder tucked so tightly against her ribs that it felt like a part of her anatomy. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots was gaining ground. Arthur's watchers didn't shout. They didn't call for her to stop. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency of predators who had already scented blood. She burst out of the alley onto a wider thoroughfare, only to be met by the blinding glare of high beams. A black SUV surged around the corner, its tires screaming as it drifted across the wet asphalt to block her path. Olivia spun on her heel, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her chest, but the exit behind her was already being choked off by 3 silhouettes in charcoal gray. They stood in a disciplined line, the red and blue strobes of a distant police cruiser reflecting off their visors, creating a grotesque mosaic of light and shadow. The law was close enough to hear her scream, but she knew with a soul-crushing certainty that the police weren't there to rescue her. They were the perimeter Arthur had paid for. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She looked at the modern corporate building to her left, a monolith of glass and steel that looked like a smaller version of the kingdom she had lost. There was no sanctuary there. She was trapped between the corporate world that had disowned her and the hunters who wanted to bury her. As the watchers closed the distance, their hands reaching for the suppressed weapons at their hips. Olivia's foot caught on a jagged piece of uneven pavement. She went down hard, the impact jarring her bones and sending a spray of icy water into the air. She lay on her side, her curly dark hair spreading across the glossy concrete like ink in a basin. The folder was still there, clutched in her trembling hand, the only evidence of her father's life. She looked up, squinting through the stinging rain, as the lead watcher stepped into the circle of light. The world began to blur at the edges, the exhaustion and terror finally taking their toll. She was a ghost being cornered in a graveyard of glass. Just as the shadow of her pursuer fell over her, the heavy roar of a different engine, something powerful, refined, and predatory, cut through the sound of the storm. The watchers hesitated, their disciplined formation wavering for the first time, as a fleet of obsidian sedans emerged from the gloom like prehistoric leviathans rising from the deep. The obsidian sedans glided to a halt with a synchronized, predatory grace, their engines humming like a low-frequency warning. The rainfall hammered against the glossy roofs, creating a veil of mist that parted only when the heavy rear door of the lead vehicle swung open. Arthur's watchers froze, their weapons lowered just an inch, a telltale sign of hesitation in the face of a superior predator. From the depths of the car, a man stepped out into the chaos.
He didn't rush.
He didn't shelter himself from the storm. Jiho stood tall, his dark tailored suit instantly soaked, his slicked-back hair shimmering under the erratic strobe of the police lights. He moved with a terrifyingly calm authority that seemed to silence the city itself. Behind him, 3 men in matching black suits stepped forward in a rigid, controlled formation, their hands folded in front of them with the practiced discipline of an elite guard. They didn't look at the police, they didn't look at the thugs. Their focus was entirely on the man who now walked toward the woman shivering on the pavement. Jiho stopped just inches from where Olivia lay. He looked down, his expression serious and focused, his eyes scanning her bruised face and the white-knuckled grip she held on the black folder. He didn't see a beggar or a fugitive. He saw the warrior's fire flickering behind her terror. Slowly, with a deliberate motion that ignored the dozen guns potentially aimed at his back, Jiho knelt on one knee on the wet pavement. The dragon's territory, his protocol, one of the watchers barked, his voice cracking with a false bravado. This girl is corporate property. Move along and there won't be a problem. Jiho didn't even turn his head. His focus remained on Olivia. Protocol, he murmured, his voice a deep, resonant silk that carried through the wind, is for those who fear the law. I am the law in this district. He reached forward, his large, warm hand closing firmly around Olivia's trembling wrist. It wasn't a grab, it was an anchor. What is in the folder? Jiho asked, his gaze searching hers. The truth, Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. The truth they killed my father for. Jiho felt the tremor in her arm, the raw defiance of a soul that refused to be deleted. He looked back at the watchers, his eyes turning to chips of black ice. Protocol has changed, he announced. Without another word, he pulled her upward, his posture suggesting both urgency and absolute protection. As his men moved to form a living shield around them, the red and blue reflections on the pavement danced across a new reality. Olivia was no longer alone in the dark. She was now under the protection of the only man in the city who could make the monsters afraid. The transition from the violent, rain-lashed street to the silence of the fortress was so absolute it felt like a shift in dimensions. When Olivia finally opened her eyes, she didn't find the sterile, peeling paint of a public hospital or the damp shadows of an alleyway. Instead, she was met by a ceiling of soft, recessed ambient light and the faint, rhythmic purr of a high-end air filtration system. The air here didn't smell of exhaust and wet pavement. It smelled of expensive cedar and the sterile, metallic tang of top-tier security. She lay beneath a duvet of charcoal silk that felt like a cool cloud against her skin. For a moment, the memory of the black folder flashed through her mind like a lightning strike, and she bolted upright, her breath hitching. Her hand went instinctively to the bedside table, but the folder was gone. In its place sat a glass of crystal-clear water and a single, heavy obsidian coin, Jiho's personal mark. "It is safe," a voice rumbled from the shadows. Olivia's gaze snapped to the corner of the room. Jiho was seated in a leather armchair, silhouetted against a panoramic window that overlooked the city. From this height, the skyscrapers looked like glowing circuit boards, and the rain was nothing more than a faint mist against the reinforced glass. He had traded his soaked suit for a casual black sweater, but his presence remained just as formidable. He held the black folder in his lap, his long fingers resting on the cover with a reverence that surprised her. "My father's code," Olivia whispered, her voice rasping from the cold she had endured. "Did you look at it?" "I looked at the truth," Jiho replied, standing and moving into the light. He didn't tower over her with a threat. He stood with the quiet weight of a mountain. "I saw the work of a man who built a kingdom on honor, and the work of a serpent who dismantled it with lies. You have been running through a world that was bought and paid for by your enemy, Olivia." He walked to the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. "In this house, the outside world does not exist. The police, your uncle, the watchers, they stop at my gates. You are no longer a fugitive. You are a guest of the dragon." Olivia looked at her hands, which were clean and bandaged, the grime of the industrial district scrubbed away. The silence of the fortress was unshakable, a fortress of iron and high-tech serenity that felt more secure than the Glass Kingdom ever had. For the first time since her father's arrest, the frantic drumming in her chest began to slow. She was in the heart of the shadow world, sheltered by a man whose name was whispered in fear, yet as she looked at Jiho, she realized that for the first time in weeks, she was finally allowed to breathe. The following morning, the fortress didn't offer the luxury of the Williams estate, but a different, more grounded form of restoration. Olivia was led to a dining area where the morning sun cut through the reinforced glass in sharp, surgical lines. On the table sat a simple, nourishing meal, not the extravagant feasts of her former life, but something designed for strength. Jiho was already there, his presence as steady and immovable as the obsidian coin he had left by her bed. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pitying glances. He watched her with the clinical gaze of a man assessing a weapon that had been left to rust in the rain. "Eat," he commanded, though the word lacked the bite of her uncle's cruelty. A body running on trauma cannot think, and a mind that cannot think cannot win. Olivia picked up the utensils, her hands still sporting the faint tremors of her time on the streets. As she ate, the silence of the room was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the black folder resting between them. For weeks, she had been a ghost, a silent observer of her own ruin, swallowed by the roar of the city and the systemic erasure orchestrated by her blood. She had forgotten the sound of her own conviction. "You have been a victim for long enough, Olivia," Jiho said, leaning forward. The light caught the sharp angle of his jaw. "The folder contains the truth, but the truth is a dead thing if it has no voice to carry it. Your uncle didn't just steal your company. He stole your right to speak. He turned you into a whisper so he could scream his lies over you." Olivia looked up, her dark eyes meeting his black eyes stare. "I tried to speak. The police, the lawyers, no one would listen." "Because you spoke to them as a beggar seeking mercy," Jiho countered, his voice dropping to a low, resonant vibration. "Mercy is for the weak. Justice is for those who are willing to take it. I can provide the shadows, the steel, and the reach, but I cannot be your voice. If we are to dismantle Arthur's kingdom, I need to know if the woman who coded the world's most secure firewalls is still in there, or if she died in cell 402 with her father." The challenge was a spark in a dry forest. Olivia felt a surge of heat, the warrior's fire Jiho had recognized on the pavement, igniting in her chest. She realized he wasn't offering her a hiding place. He was offering her an armory. She set her fork down, the clink of silver against porcelain sharp and final. She straightened her back, shedding the distressed vulnerability that had been her only companion. "My father didn't build that company on luck," Olivia said, her voice finding a cold, sharp clarity she thought she had lost. "He built it on integrity." Arthur thinks he's deleted me, but he's only made me the one thing he can't account for in his spreadsheets, a ghost with nothing left to lose. Jiho's lips didn't curve into a smile, but his eyes softened with a grim satisfaction. He stood up, sliding the black folder across the table toward her. Then let us begin. Tell me how we bleed him. The black folder lay open on a glass table in the heart of Jiho's command center, its contents illuminated by the cool, sapphire glow of a dozen monitors. Olivia sat at the terminal, her fingers flying across a customized haptic keyboard with a speed that blurred. She wasn't just showing Jiho files, she was peeling back the skin of a corporate monster. Behind them, Jiho's lead tech specialist stood in silent awe, watching as a 24-year-old girl bypassed encryptions they had deemed unbreakable. There, Olivia whispered, hitting a final key. The screen flooded with a cascading waterfall of red data. Arthur didn't just forge a will. He created a ghost network within the Williams global servers. Every time my father authorized a charity shipment or a security patch, Arthur was piggybacking a secondary stream of encrypted assets to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing the company's soul. Jiho leaned in, his eyes tracking the flow of the illicit transactions. The legal gangbang was now laid bare in high definition. He saw the digital signatures of the judges Arthur had bribed, the wire transfers to the cleaners who had hunted Olivia, and most chillingly, the medical override log from the night her father died. The log showed a remote hack into the prison's infirmary system, a deliberate spike in a digital heart monitor that had triggered a fatal, untraceable shock to Elias's pacemaking device. He didn't just frame him, Jiho murmured, his voice vibrating with a cold, lethal frequency. He executed him from a boardroom 10 miles away. The air in the room grew heavy, the temperature seeming to drop as the dragon processed the depth of the rot. Jiho's men, hardened by years of underworld warfare, shifted uncomfortably. They were used to blood and iron, but this clinical, digital assassination of a good man was a different kind of evil. Olivia looked up from the screen, her face pale but her eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. The distressed vulnerability was gone, replaced by the calculating precision of a master architect. He thinks he's safe because he deleted the trails on the main server, Olivia said, her voice steady. But my father built a failsafe. This folder is the mirror image of everything Arthur tried to erase. I have the keys to every vault he thinks he owns. I have the names of every politician in his pocket. Jiho looked from the screen to Olivia. He saw no longer a victim, but a strategist who had just handed him the map to a war. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, a gesture of absolute alignment. You have given me the how, Olivia. Now, I will give you the when. We won't just take your company back. We will strip the oxygen from his lungs until he begs for the silence of the cell he put your father in. The decryption was complete. The truth was out of the shadows, and for the first time, the hunter was about to become the prey. The digital dismantling of Arthur's stolen kingdom began not with a bang, but with a series of whispers in the code. From the reinforced safety of Jiho's command center, Olivia became a ghost in the machine she had helped build. Her fingers danced across the keys with a rhythmic, lethal precision, slipping through the back doors she and her father had designed as a final failsafe. She didn't launch a frontal assault. Instead, she moved like an undetectable virus, slowly unraveling the logic of Arthur's infrastructure. One by one, the Watchers found their encrypted communications lagging by mere milliseconds, just enough to cause a fatal lack of coordination. In the corporate offices, the proprietary code that Arthur was preparing to sell to the highest bidder began to subtly mutate. Algorithms that were once flawlessly efficient started to return nonsensical data, turning billion-dollar projections into digital gibberish. Every time Arthur's IT team attempted a patch, they found themselves locked out by an administrator privilege that technically didn't exist. He's panicking, Olivia murmured, her face illuminated by the flickering green light of the monitors. Beside her, Jiho stood like a shadow, watching as she redirected offshore funds into untraceable escrow accounts. He's watching his net worth bleed out in real time, and he has no idea where the wound is. Olivia felt a cold, sharp satisfaction as she accessed Arthur's private server. She began leaking anonymized tips to the few remaining honest journalists and federal investigators, tiny fragments of the forged documents and the evidence of the bribed judges. She was stripping away the layers of his legal protection, piece by digital piece. She wasn't just sabotaging a company, she was erasing the legacy of a liar. Jiho watched her transformation with a grim, silent respect. The woman who had collapsed in the rain was gone, replaced by a technical titan who fought with logic and lightning. He leaned down, his voice a low vibration near her ear. The digital world is bleeding, Olivia. But eventually, a cornered animal will stop looking at the screen and start looking for the hand that holds the knife. Let him look, Olivia replied, her eyes never leaving the cascading lines of code. By the time he realizes I'm the one holding the blade, there won't be anything left of his world to save. As she hit the enter key, a massive power surge rolled through the Williams global headquarters 5 miles away, plunging Arthur's office into darkness. The ghost had officially taken control of the machine, and the countdown to Arthur's total liquidation had begun. The digital sabotage had stripped Arthur of his composure, but a cornered animal is most dangerous when its back is against the wall. Desperate to locate the hand behind the knife, Arthur reached into the one place he knew Olivia couldn't remain a ghost, her heart. It began with a public broadcast, a press release that flashed across the city's digital billboards and invaded every news feed. Arthur appeared on screen, a black armband around his expensive wool sleeve, standing in front of the Williams family mausoleum. With a voice trembling in practiced, oily grief, he announced a memorial clearing of her father's private study, claiming that Elias's final, unrecorded personal journals, the ones he had promised only to his daughter, would be donated to a public archive if she didn't come to claim them by midnight. It's a vulture's trap, Jiho said, his voice a low warning as he stood behind Olivia in the dim light of the command center. He watched her knuckles turn white as she gripped the edge of the terminal. He knows you are watching. He knows the one thing you won't let him delete is the sound of your father's private thoughts. Olivia looked at the screen, her chest tightening. She knew it was a lure, a desperate attempt to bring her out into the open where his cleaners could finally finish what they started in the rain. But the thought of Arthur's hands on her father's journals, the records of the man's soul, the radical kindness, the dreams he had only shared with her, was a violation she couldn't endure. Arthur was using her father's memory as bait, desecrating the dead to trap the living. He expects me to come alone, desperate and weeping, Olivia whispered, her voice like a sharpening blade. The distressed vulnerability was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. He thinks he is the hunter because he has the bait. He doesn't realize he's just invited the dragon into his own house. Jiho leaned in, his dark eyes reflecting the sapphire glow of the monitors. If you go as my shadow. We don't just reclaim the journals, Olivia. We burn the trap and the trapper with it. Olivia stood up, her silhouette sharp against the wall of data. She didn't look like a fugitive anymore. She looked like an executioner. The vulture had laid his trap, but he had forgotten one crucial truth. A ghost can't be caught, and a dragon doesn't play by the rules of the hunted. Prepare the cars, she commanded, her voice finding its final, lethal frequency. It's time to show my uncle that some legacies are written in blood, and blood doesn't forget. The Williams Global Boardroom, once a sanctuary of innovation, had been transformed into a cold stage for Arthur's final act. He sat at the head of the mahogany table, surrounded by the board members he had bought and the lawyers who had sanitized his crimes. The atmosphere was thick with the smug scent of victory until the heavy double doors didn't just open. They were thrown wide by a force that didn't ask for permission. Olivia stepped into the room first. She didn't look like the broken girl they had cast into the rain. She wore a suit of obsidian silk, her head held high, her eyes radiating a lethal, calculated calm. But it was the man who followed her that caused the oxygen to vanish from the room. Jiho entered like a silent storm, his presence so heavy and predatory that the hired security detail instinctively stepped back, their hands trembling near their holsters. The dragon had entered the glass kingdom, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. "This is a private session," Arthur stammered, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat.
Guard.
"Remove this vagrant and her thugs." Jiho didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to the opposite end of the table and pulled out a chair for Olivia, then stood behind her like an immovable shadow. "The only vagrant in this room," Jiho said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that rattled the crystal water carafes, "is the man sitting in a seat he didn't earn." With a sharp click, Olivia slid a slim tablet onto the table. "You wanted the journals, Arthur? I have something better." She swiped the screen, and the wall-sized monitors surged to life. Instead of the corporate logos, the room was flooded with the digital evidence of the black folder, the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, the forged signatures, and the heartbeat override log from cell 402. The board members gasped, their loyalties evaporating the moment they saw the depth of the rot. Olivia stood up, leaning over the table until she was inches from her uncle's face. "I didn't just sabotage your servers, Arthur. I bought your debt. Every offshore account you used to frame my father now belongs to Jiho's network. You aren't just a criminal, you're bankrupt." Arthur looked at the monitors, then at the silent, stone-faced bodyguards Jiho had stationed at every exit. He was a man who had lived by the lie, and now the truth was stripping the air from his lungs. Jiho leaned down, his eyes turning to chips of black ice. "I don't care about your laws," the dragon whispered, "but I care about a daughter's justice. You have 60 seconds to sign the confession and the restoration of assets, or you leave this building in a way the police won't be able to document." The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur reached for the pen with a shaking hand, realizing that in the presence of the dragon, his serpent smile had finally run out of venom. The oxygen was gone, and the kingdom was officially being reclaimed. The transition from the boardroom to the summit of the Williams tech empire was not just a return of power, but a coronation of a new kind of leader. On a crisp, clear morning, the lobby of the headquarters hummed with a different frequency, one that lacked the hollow artifice of Arthur's reign. The biometric scanners, now recalibrated by Olivia's own hand, chimed a melodic green as she stepped through the doors. She was no longer the girl in the damp green jacket. She moved with a measured, lethal grace, wearing the dragon's protection like a second skin. Behind her, a phalanx of security in sharp black suits fanned out in a silent, living shield, their discipline a stark warning to anyone who still harbored the rot of the old regime. Olivia entered the executive office on the 60th floor, the glass kingdom, now reclaimed and purified. The air felt thin and sharp, high above the noise of the streets where she had once been a ghost. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city that had once swallowed her whole. Beside her stood the desk that had belonged to her father, but she didn't sit immediately. Instead, she traced the edge of the mahogany, feeling the weight of the legacy she had fought through fire and rain to save. Jiho stood by the door, his muscular frame a solid anchor against the morning light. He didn't offer a smile, but his dark eyes held a rare, piercing respect. He had watched her evolve from a broken fugitive into a woman who could command both the digital and shadow worlds. "Justice is a cold foundation, Olivia," he said, his voice a low vibration that carried the weight of his own history. "But loyalty is what makes the structure stand. You have the mind of a visionary and the fire of a warrior. The kingdom is yours, but remember the cost of the crown." Olivia turned to face him, her deep brown skin glowing with health and a fierce, quiet confidence. "I haven't forgotten the industrial district, Jiho, or the rain." She sat in the CEO chair, her posture rigid and composed. "The Williams Park Foundation for At-Risk Youth opens its doors tomorrow. I've ensured that no one in this city will ever have to be a ghost again. They will have the education my father wanted for me and the protection you gave me." As she signed her first executive order, merging her father's radical integrity with the absolute security of Jiho's network, the sun glinted off the obsidian coin resting on her desk. The cycle was complete. Olivia was no longer just an heir. She was a bridge between two worlds, a leader who had been forged in betrayal and tempered by the dragon. The Glass Kingdom was no longer a cage of light. It was a fortress of truth, and the reign of Olivia Williams Park had finally begun. Loyalty is not proven in comfort. It is tested in betrayal. Olivia lost her father, her name, and her kingdom in a single storm, but what her uncle failed to understand is this: you can steal a title, but you cannot erase integrity. The world tried to delete her, to rewrite her story as weakness and failure. Instead, she rewrote it as justice. If this story moved you, if you believe that justice may be delayed but never denied, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Join a community where resilience rises, where villains fall, and where every ghost gets their voice back. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We remind you that even in the shadows, warriors are born. Thanks for staying with us. Stay blessed and stay beautiful.